listeners. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Kieran. Isn't that always the way? As soon as I unmute, I start choking on my tea. So I'm sorry for that, but let's see if we can get through this. Really grateful to be invited to be a part of this conversation with you today, Kieran, and Andranel and everybody else who's been involved. And so nice to be able to follow my colleague Amal, who's been such an amazing agent of progress, not just on this issue, but on a whole range of issues within the United Nations. So really grateful for being a part of it as well. But I just really have one message today, which is really that it's time. 10 years into this enterprise, we still have a lot of folks who have been reticent about moving forward and following the advice of the Secretary General to really expedite action on the adoption of a new international legal instrument on the protection of the human rights of older persons. And you have to believe that after the year that we've just lived through, where we've seen a curtain pulled back on a second pandemic, if I can call it that, driven by a global virus of ageism, age discrimination, vulnerability, neglect, abuse, that this is the moment at which if folks aren't going to see it now, they're not going to see it at all. And we have to insist that they do. Really, across the globe, older persons, their rights, their actual lives have been the first victims of COVID-19, of this pandemic. If you measure it by infections, if you measure it by serious illness, if you measure it by deaths, it's older persons who have really been most ravaged by this pandemic. We've seen in the reporting that we get gross negligence turning nursing homes and care facilities into killing grounds. We've seen some countries adopting vaccine distribution plans that only cover people under the age of 60. So that's like a Western country adopting an anti-racial discrimination law that only covers white people. I mean, these kinds of things are absolutely what the international human rights movement has been warning about for all of these years. We've seen public positions taken by politicians and public health officials in some countries openly talking effectively about sacrificing older persons and migrants, by the way, in so-called herd immunity strategies to benefit younger persons and citizens. How did this happen? How did we get here? This is the question. And we really think that a part of this flows from the original sin of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The cornerstone of the entire international human rights law edifice, the entire international human rights movement. It was an amazing document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 30 articles, dealing with all aspects of human rights, all of the building blocks of a new order of freedom from fear and freedom from want, but not a word about discrimination on the basis of age. A really remarkable omission. It explicitly prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, language, religion, political, other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status, but not a word about age. And when you think that it was the Universal Declaration that was the basis for all the subsequent instruments adopted, treaties and so on in the international human rights regime, you realize how that original sin has continued to affect the situation of older persons even today. It means that very little attention, relatively speaking, has been given to the human rights of older persons by international human rights monitors, international human rights mechanisms. And now there's a lot of reason to believe that this is the moment at which we can hope that that gap, which has existed since 1948, will finally be filled. First, because the human life cycle is changing, obviously. People are living longer, they're working longer, creating longer, participating longer in society, marrying later, having children later, retiring later. Second, because older persons are a growing constituency, already large, but we know that by 2045, for the first time in human history, older persons will be more than children, there'll be more older persons than children in the world. By 2050, they'll represent a fifth of the global population. Third, we know from our monitoring that this constituency is increasingly subjected to a broad range of violations of their civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, perpetrated against them because they are older persons. Ageism, age discrimination, exclusion, deprivation, abuse. We've seen it all. This includes institutional neglect and abuse, denial of work, social security, healthcare, other essential services, denial of a voice in political processes, targeting by con artists and violent criminals, and interference in their own autonomous decisions about their personal finance, property, housing, and medical care. And then finally, Kieran, in terms of justification, the yawning gaps, really huge gaps in regulatory, policy, programmatic, and legal frameworks, both at the national and the international level, have left older persons without adequate protection, redress, or power. So you have this broad range of treaties now that protects all other groups from discrimination, but no international convention on the human rights of older persons. This makes older persons invisible in international protection. And there's a growing body of evidence that suggests in countries across the world, aging is becoming an experience marked by vulnerability, exclusion, abuse, discrimination, and deprivation. We've seen even in countries where indicators of racism are declining, indicators of ageism are increasing. And in the absence of international standards and the face of low or sometimes non-existent national standards, we've seen shocking cases of institutional neglect and abuse of seniors. And the COVID pandemic, again, has revealed that for everybody to see. Public policy at the national level is lagging behind, and many in this disempowered group lack a political voice. There are gaps in standards. Older persons are not addressed by the international instruments. Some of these are in areas relating to legal capacity, legal planning, equality before the law, especially people subjected to various forms of guardianship. Similar problems with long-term and institutional care. We've heard all of these heartbreaking stories of older persons being denied care or exposed to diseases like COVID, or forced to live in unsanitary conditions, or subjected to physical abuse, or sequestered against their will and exploited financially and otherwise. The problem here is not an absence of resources to protect older persons, but a problem of an absence of standards and of enforcement. And while we have an international framework to protect children and women and other groups from violence, there is nothing to protect older persons from violence at the international level. There are other gaps as well that I'll just quickly mention. Issues that are at the heart of the aging experience, like mandatory retirement, access to productive resources, political and social participation, standards for end-of-life care, palliative care, geriatric health care. All of these lack human rights standards at the international level and often at the national level as well. So remedying these means we have to move to fill these gaps, not with piecemeal approaches, but with a new international human rights treaty on the rights of older persons. This treaty will provide us an opportunity to finally have a comprehensive framework for setting standards everywhere, a single platform for advocacy by all of us, a vehicle for constructive international dialogue and cooperation, an instrument for accountability for the first time. It would also help us to do global monitoring, benchmarking, data collection, disaggregation, and reporting. And most importantly, Kieran, and I'll finish here, a convention would catalyze this global paradigm shift that we need now more than ever, away from the failed approaches of charity and the traditional approaches of the past, and toward a recognition of older persons as rights holders, to move away from charity into accountability, away from arbitrariness into the rule of law, and away from pity and into power, which is really the challenge of the day. There is nothing magical that happens when somebody turns 60 or 65 that explains their differential treatment on the basis of age. Only discrimination does, and that discrimination has to end. If we can free all of these gaps, fill all of these gaps, and move away from ageism and age discrimination, we can actually see a future where dignity, as Amal said, is the center of the lives of older persons. We can ensure that the experience of old age is one that celebrates diversity, magnifies the dignity and worth of every human person. But if we're going to get there, that's going to depend on the action that all of us participating in this conversation take now, this year, in the coming weeks, especially. And I hope that everyone is going to make their voice heard on demanding that we move forward on this new convention. I think in the wake of COVID, there is no more room for complacency, no more room for obfuscation or delay. And the future of our society depends on it. As Amal said, our economies depend on it, and the lives and well-being of millions of older persons certainly depend on it. Kieran, I think the curtain has been pulled back, and we have to move now on remedying these horrors and moving toward the adoption of a new convention. And I'll stop there. Thank you.